Hey everybody, Josh Collacchi here once again at RotoCurve.com, and we're here to discuss Week 12 cash game picks on FanDuel. This is for NFL DFS. Of course, on FanDuel, you got to pick between a whole bunch of teams, a whole bunch of players, and we're looking at one quarterback, two running backs, three receivers, a tight end, a kicker, and a deep end. So without further ado, let's get right into it for this week. Two guys I like at quarterback, the first one being Carson Palmer, are two of the most consistent options in the NFL, especially in terms of production. Now, the reason why I like Palmer as my top option at 8,100 is because he has at least two touchdown passes in 8 of 10 games this season. Now, I can't stress that enough because for quarterbacks, you're looking at least two touchdown passes in order to reach value or reach enough fantasy points that you need for a given night. And that's exactly what Palmer has been able to do in 80% of his games this season. And that's a very good number. Palmer also this week faces the 49ers, who have given up at least one touchdown pass in each of the 9 games. In addition, they've also allowed the 6th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks this season. So you see that Palmer has a very good matchup for this given week, and considering the fact that he's been very consistent and the Niners have given up touchdowns on a consistent basis, it kind of comes into a perfect storm. In addition, Palmer ranks as number 1 on RotoCurve's fantasy point per passing attempt tool, which you can find for free on the RotoCurve.com site, with 0.71 fantasy points per passing attempt. Now, what that means is he's been very efficient with his attempts, and considering that offense is one of the more high-volume passing offenses in the NFL, that means he's earned a lot of fantasy points this season, and he's likely to continue that trend in a good matchup against the Niners. The other quarterback I wanted to discuss was Marcus Mariota, the rookie sensation for the Tennessee Titans. This week at just 7,000, he gets a great matchup against the Oakland Raiders, who have given up 20 fantasy points or more to opposing cornerbacks in 4 of the last 5 games. The one thing about Mariota is he has averaged over 17 FanDuel points per game this season, but he has not run the ball much. And considering the fact that he was one of the top rushing quarterbacks in Oregon in college, he has the ability to do so. He's really quick. He has a sturdy body at 6'4" and over 215 pounds. He can do it, but the Titans have just chosen to let him sit in the pocket, and he has actually done very well doing that. That being said, coaches said that they would like to give him more opportunities to run the ball, and that's exactly what's going to translate to more fantasy points. That's another reason why I like Mariota this week against a weak Raiders defense, especially at just 7,000. Moving on to running back, there are 3 guys here, 1 high-priced guy and then 2 cheap guys I wanted to talk about. The first one being Adrian Peterson, who was the most expensive running back at 9,000 for the Minnesota Vikings on FanDuel. He does face the Atlanta Falcons, who have allowed just over 700 yards rushing on the season, which is among the lowest in the NFL. They've given up 3.5 yards per carry, and that may kind of pique your interest a little bit because it's odd picking a cash game running back in a tough matchup. But is it actually a tough matchup? I'm not so sure. If you look at the Falcons' schedule, they have struggled against the Eagles, Cowboys, Saints, and Colts. Each of these teams have talented running backs. You're looking at guys from DeMarco Murray to Ryan Matthews to guys like Joseph Randle, who was talented before he was maligned off field. We had Darren McFadden, who's been playing well, Mark Ingram, Frank Gore. All these backs have been successful in their career, and they have a lot of athletic ability and a good offensive line in front of them. The guys that Atlanta has stopped, and I think this is why their numbers are so good this season, are Shane Vereen, Alfred Blue, Chris Thompson, Matt Jones, guys like Bishop Sankey, Doug Martin, who's been a very good running back this season, so that was a good matchup and a good performance by the Atlanta defense. But he's an anomaly because the only other defense or any other offense that the Falcons have stopped in terms of their running game, it's the Niners, who had an injury-filled roster of running backs with Reggie Bush going down, Carlos Hyde going down. So considering the fact that the Falcons have struggled in bad matchups, and that's exactly what they have against Adrian Peterson, that's a good thing for Peterson, as he's been very successful this season, carrying the ball over 200 times. He has over 1,000 yards and 6 touchdowns, I believe. So Peterson is the top back for me in cash game because I do think he does have a quietly good matchup. That being said, with the 2 cheap options behind him, I think I'm only going to be using him in a few games and using the cheap backs behind him as my core, and that's Thomas Rawls and Javorius Buck Allen. First thing I like about Rawls is the fact that he just sees an absolute ton of value, or a ton of volume, rather. He actually has been a ton of value as well. So Rawls has averaged 6 yards per carry this season. In 2 starts, he's gotten 53 carries for almost 400 yards. You can see a 378 and 3 touchdowns. 2 have come on the ground, 1 come through the air. And Rawls has been heard saying that he feels like less of a person when he runs out of bounds. Now, that's good for fantasy guys because that means he's just going to see an extra few yards in every carry. Considering the fact he's seen 53 carries, that's going to translate to another 15, 20, even 25 yards, and that's just more fantasy points. He does have a tough matchup this week against the Steelers, who have allowed the least amount of fantasy points to opposing running backs this season. But considering the talent that Rawls has shown and the ton of value that he's gotten, I think he's worth his price, especially at just $6,300 against the Pittsburgh Steelers. So I will be having him in my cash lineups. And if you're comfortable with playing a guy that has a ton of volume, although he does have a tough matchup, I think he's worth the price at just $6,300. Another guy at $6,300, it's a backup running back named Javorius Allen, also known as Buck Allen from USC. With Justin Forsett going down for probably the rest of the season due to a broken arm, Allen's going to take the reins as a starting running back for the Baltimore Ravens. Now, also last week, the Ravens lost their starting quarterback in Joe Flacco to a torn ACL. So they're looking at Matt Schaub and Javorius Allen as their quarterback running back battery. That's the one thing I want to look at that because I don't think they're going to be putting Matt Schaub, who I believe is the starting quarterback for the Ravens, as a guy throwing 30 or 40 times. That being said, that means you're going to see Allen get a lot of carries, and I think that translates to a lot of fantasy points, especially this week in a good matchup against the Cleveland Browns. The Browns have allowed the most rushing yards in football at over 1,200, and it's the one good thing about this matchup because a guy like Allen, if he's getting a good matchup, he's going to get a lot of yards and a lot of carries because I think that's exactly what the Ravens are going to do. At just $6,300, you can pair him with Rawls, and you can have 2 running backs for just over $12,000 on FanDuel. So that's huge for your lineups. Moving on to wide receiver, excuse me. I like Julio Jones this week. Now, he's the most expensive player on the entire site at $9,300, but with those cheap running backs, I think you can afford to pay up for a guy like this. He faces the Minnesota Vikings and Xavier Rhodes, and of course Rhodes has had a reputation of a good cornerback as he was one of the top cornerbacks last season in terms of limiting production. But this season he struggled a little bit, and it's not just the penalties, which he is known for, but he's given up a lot of touchdown passes as well. Now, Julio Jones is a tough matchup for anyone, but considering he's facing Rhodes, who has struggled a bit this season, that just gives him a boost. Through 10 games this season, Jones is averaging 9 catches for over 100 yards per game, 119 per game exactly, as you can see, and he scored 6 touchdowns. So for a guy that's averaging over 20 FanDuel points per game at the wide receiver position, especially it being a half-point PPR, I think his value is pretty much north of his price at $9,300. So considering the fact that he does have a quietly good matchup against Xavier Rhodes, who struggled this year, I think he's worth the price at $9,300. So if you do want to spend up at wide receiver and go cheap at other positions, he's the guy I think you should start with. The next guy is Larry Fitzgerald, who has been very consistent this season and kind of a rebirth to his career, especially with Carson Palmer starting for the majority of this season and hopefully for the rest of the season, as he's tended to have injury issues. That being said, with Fitzgerald's consistency and considering the fact that he has a great matchup this week, at $7,400, I think it's a worthy price to pay. Fitzgerald also pairs perfectly if you do want to use Carson Palmer in your cash games. A lot of people don't necessarily like stacking a receiver with a quarterback in cash games because if that particular game doesn't go as planned, it could ruin your entire lineup. Now, for me, I like volume catchers to be paired with a quarterback if you like both matchups, and I don't think it's an issue, and it's proven not to be an issue with a guy like Fitzgerald, who's caught 5 or more passes in a majority of the games this season. The one thing that I like about Fitzgerald is he has caught touchdowns as well, and you're going to need those from your receivers on FanDuel because when you look at the scoring system at just half-point PPR, for a guy to get a lot of points from catches, he's going to need 10, 11, 12, 13 catches. So you're going to want to look at a guy that scores a lot of touchdowns, and Fitzgerald has done that, catching, I believe, 7 touchdowns this season. In terms of his consistency, he has 13 FanDuel points or more in 7 of 10 games. He has at least 5 catches in all but 1 game this season. And the matchup that he has against the San Francisco 49ers gives him the ability to get a main piece of a defense that has allowed an average of 13 catches for 188 yards and a touchdown per game to opposing wide receivers this season. At just 7,400, I think that's a worthy bet. And you know Bruce Arians and that Cardinals offense is going to throw the ball a lot, as we discussed earlier with Palmer, and his top option is Larry Fitzgerald. The third guy is a guy that I've used pretty much every week this season in cash, and that's Eric Decker. And honestly, when you look at his consistency, it really doesn't seem like there's a matchup that can stop him, and I definitely don't think that's going to stop this week against the Dolphins. Decker has been impeccable this season in terms of consistency, as he's notched a touchdown in all but 2 games. In those 2 games, he has 4 catches for 81 yards in one game. That was last week, and he had 6 catches for 94 yards in the other game. So considering the fact that in the games where he hasn't caught a touchdown, he's registered at least 10 FanDuel points, that's good enough for me. And although he's a little bit more expensive than he has been at 7,100, his consistency of at least 10 fantasy points in each week is really giving me the safe haven to basically put him in my lineups unless there's a really difficult matchup. The matchup this week is not a difficult one against the Miami Dolphins, who have really struggled because they don't have a number 1 corner. What I mean by that is a lot of guys will cover one guy. They will shade a top receiver, like we talked about Xavier Rhodes. He will be shadowing Julio Jones. Now, the Jets have 2 excellent receivers in Brandon Marshall and Eric Decker. So Miami has struggled this season, allowing at least 1 touchdown pass to opposing receivers in each of the last 9 games. Now, that stems from the fact that they don't have that number 1 shutdown corner. So they don't have many guys that can just shadow one guy. And that really bodes well for Decker and Brandon Marshall as well. But considering Decker has been more consistent, I'm willing to put him in most of my lineups, especially in cash at just 7,100. Moving on to the last position, but certainly not least, is that's tight end. Now, I'm going to mention Rob Gronkowski here simply because he is Rob Gronkowski, but we don't have to delve into that. Of course, he's the number 1 tight end pretty much each and every week because of his ability and his obvious upside, but he's really expensive. So I don't really think that I'm going to be spending on him in cash games unless I can afford him. Now, you can go with 3 mid to low price receivers and those 2 cheap running backs and afford Gronkowski, but for me, I'd rather pay up for a guy like Julio Jones. 2 tight ends I do like this week each have excellent matchups. And the first guy is Delaney Walker for the Titans at just 6,100 against the Raiders. Walker is a great pairing with Mariota if you do want to use Mariota in cash games because he faces the Raiders, who have been really awful against tight ends this season. Oakland's given up 10 touchdowns to opposing tight ends this season. They've given up 1 or more in 8 of these 10 games. And considering that they've been a target for opposing tight ends all season long, Walker's going to be highly owned in cash games, and you're probably going to be blocking a lot of other people if you take him in head-to-heads. I expect him to be highly owned, and considering his floor of at least 9 FanDuel points of 7 and 9 games this season, he has double-digit and over 13 FanDuel points, 3 in his last 6. So he does have a good floor. He does have a good ceiling. He has Mariota throwing to him, so that 2 combination could create a lot of FanDuel points this weekend against the Raiders. And to get a piece of that passing offense with that quarterback, and you're just spending 6,100 for his top receiver, I think that's worth a look in cash games. The other guy is Jordan Reed at 5,800 against the Giants. Reed has a sprained ligament in his knee. I believe they announced it was a sprained MCL. But it's weird because he's not on the injury report this season. So apparently it's not bothering him, and apparently it's an injury he can just play through. And that makes him for an excellent option once again because the Giants really struggled against tight ends this season. They've given up the most fantasy points to opposing tight ends in terms of FanDuel points per game. The fact that Jordan Reed has been one of the heaviest targeted tight ends in the game, I believe he has the same amount of targets per game as Gronkowski. That's something to note. And also in the first matchup between these games, Reed caught 6 passes for 96 yards. One more bit of information, he's averaging 12.5 FanDuel points per game, which is only behind Rob Gronkowski, Tyler Eifert, and Gary Barnidge. And each of those guys cost either 1,000 or more on the cap. So be sure to take a look at Reed for your options and tight end. If you don't want to spend the extra 300 for Walker, you can look at Jordan Reed at 5,800 and maybe upgrade your kicker or your defense. That'll essentially wrap up this week's cash game video. Thanks for watching. And as always, be sure to give us a thumbs up so we can continue to bring you analysis each and every week. And be sure to check out those RotoCurve tools. They're all free. You can look at them on the site at RotoCurve.com. You can see more tools, more analysis like this. There's a great community of DFS players. There's your own chat page for people that like to do instant messaging between each other. talk about matchups, talk about players, talk about sweats that you're having for a given night. It's a great community of players, and everything over there is free, so be sure to take advantage of it and use everything to your advantage to get a top FanDuel lineup for Week 12 and cash games. Good luck, everybody, and let this week be a profitable one.